Livracha. To thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya, Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of their dear friend and mentor, Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch, Zichron Livracha, and our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Bernhard and Varda Birnbaum, in commemoration of the 18th yahrzeit of Bernhard's beloved father, Pinchas Hillel ben Shlomo, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the nishamas will have an aliyah, and the families a neshama. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful, really fascinating daf ahead of us today. So again, today's daf is Samich Zayin 67, and we are picking up on Samich Vav Amud Beis 66b. Okay, 66b. So both say, so remember again, we're picking up about 20 lines up from the bottom on Samich Vav Amud Beis. So just to reorient ourselves a bit, if you remember again, we were discussing yesterday the fascinating machlokes. We discussed yesterday in general about the concept of nishmas tzon barzel, nishmas mulug, the fundamental difference between those two types of property. Nishmas mulug, remember again, wife brings them into the marriage, husband has usage. Wife retains title, complete title, and again, upon dissolution of the marriage, wife gets whatever is remaining back. As opposed to nishmas tzon barzel, which are evaluated at the time of the marriage, the value is guaranteed by the husband, and upon death or divorce, the wife gets back the value of the item. The machlokes we were having is the following case. What happens if upon divorce, the wife brought in the Rolex watch, it was worth $20,000, now they're getting divorced, she wants the watch back, he says, no, I'm not giving you back the watch, rather again, I'm going to give you the value, here's a check for $20,000. So, what's the halacha? So we'll say, so this is a machlokes in Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Huda said, Hadin ima, ultimately, she has a right to go ahead and get back the watch. And his logic was, Shevach beis aviha didahavi, which means that halacha l'maisa, the property that she brings into her marriage has a certain sentimental value as well, and therefore she has the right to take it out with her. Versus Rabbi Ami, who said, no, essentially, since the husband took complete achrayus for the property, therefore effectively what? It becomes his. And because it becomes his, he has the right to go ahead and simply give her the cash value. So we'll say we're in the middle of that machlokes. So says the Gemara, Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, B'shili, Pirkei, Rav Nachman, the Yosef, Kamri, so also Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef were sitting together at the end of the shir of Rav Nachman, and they sat and they said, Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Huda, the Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Ami. There's a brisa that supports Rabbi Huda, and a brisa that supports Rabbi Ami. Let's analyze. Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Ami. There's a brisa that supports Rabbi Ami. Now also Rabbi Ami holds Hadin imo, that the husband has the right to keep the object and simply pay the wife the value. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Avdei tzon barzel, yotzin b'shein v'ayim ish, avalo l'isha. I will say this is fascinating. Remember again, the halacha is, if you have an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish servant, what's the halacha? If you knock out his tooth or his eye, he goes free. So both listen to this. In a case of Avdei Tzon Barzel, so the wife brings in Avodim into the marriage, but they are Nechsei Tzon Barzel, it is only if the husband knocks out their tooth or their eye that they go free, but not if the wife does. Now we'll say why? Because the halach of Shein V'ayin is only a din in the owner. So what do you see from here? Even though the wife retains title, because the husband has complete achrayus, he becomes like the owner. So there's a brisa that would support that the husband effectively becomes the owner of the nechsei tzon barzel. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda. We have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yehuda. Hamachneses shum lebayla. So we'll say here's the case. The case over here is the halacha l'maisa hamachneses, which means a wife is bringing property into the marriage, but it's shum. Its property is evaluated. Whereas the word said this is nechsei tzon barzel. She's bringing nechsei tzon barzel into the marriage. Imrat sabal limkar lo yimkar. If the husband wants to sell the property, he doesn't have the right to sell the property. V'la say now, what does that show you? The fact that he doesn't have the right to sell nechsei tzon barzel. What does that show you? That he's not the owner. Right? So even though he has achrayus, even though he has responsibility for it, he's not the owner. Remember again, not only that, Imratza habal limkar lo yimkar. I will say here it gets even more interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa, even if the husband brought certain valuated property in, he can't sell it. He can't sell it. I will say that's because that has to do ultimately with a ksuva lien against property. Machru shneim leparnasa. If let's say I will say they both decided to sell it ultimately for household parnasa. Zeh haya ma'asav Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. This was an episode of the Habit for Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. V'amar habal motzi miyad dalakuchos. And he explained that halacha l'maisa, a husband has the right to go ahead and extract that from purchasers. Okay, I will say, so there's a lot in this brisa. The point that we are supposed to take from this brisa is what? Is that halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda paskins hadin ima, right? And in this particular case, what do you see over here? Sorry. In this particular case, it says, the husband is not permitted to go ahead and sell the property. So the fact that the husband is not permitted to sell nishmas son barzel tells you that what? He's not the owner. He's not the owner. So therefore we'll say a brisa that just supports both of these opinions. Okay, so we'll say, so bottom line, all we did is we just bolstered the machlokes by quoting a brisa which supports both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Ami. And I will say, so we are still left with our fundamental machlokes. Who is considered to be the owner of nishmas son barzel? We have Rabbi Yehuda saying she is the owner. She is the owner. Rabbi Ami essentially saying since the husband has achrayus, he is the owner. Rabbi say, what's the nafkamina as to who is the owner? What's the nafkamina? Right? So first of all, it's interesting. We just saw another nafkamina. Nafkamina Ramon could be who has potentially the right to sell it during marriage, although that's not really such a good nafkamina, because one can make the argument that no one has the right to sell it during marriage. Okay, we'll leave it on the side. But the bigger nafkamina is the case we're dealing with now. A couple is getting divorced. She brought in the nishmas son barzel Rolex watch. The watch is right here, right? The watch is perfectly preserved. It's still there. He says, I'm keeping it. Here's $20,000. She says, I want it back. Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Ami. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Rava says in Rav Nachman, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, namely hadin ima, that this property represents her property from her father's home, and therefore again she has claim to it. She has claim to it. Okay, so the Gemara says, Amalei Rav Nachman, Vatanya Kavase Rabbi Ami. But Rav says, Rav Nachman, how can you say the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? We quoted a brisa that supports Rabbi Ami. Afagad Vesanya Kavase Rabbi Ami. Mistabra Taima Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Shevach Beis Aviha. So I will say, interestingly enough, he said to him, so Rav said to Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman said back to Rav, you're right. Even though there is a brisa that supports Rabbi Ami, the svara, right, the logic of Rabbi Yehuda is stronger. In other words, Rabbi will say, the property that a woman brings into a marriage reflects or represents property that she has from her father's home. So because of that, if the property is extant, right, if the property is there and it's intact, she has every right to get it back. Every right to get it back. So the Gemara tells the story. The Gemara says, he is Isa, the Aydele Legavra, Itztala Dimilsa. Big Suvasa. So I'll say, so what happened? There was a particular woman who brought into the marriage a wool cloak. That I will say, interestingly enough, the wool cloak was brought in, literally again, big Suvasa. It was put in the ksuva. So I will say, interestingly enough, what that means is, it's nishmas son barzel. So it was brought in, right? It was brought in with a particular value. Nishmas son barzel. Okay. Shachiv. The husband died. So what was something very interesting happened. Shaklua yasmi uparsua amisna. The children took the wool cloak and they spread it over the body of their father. So they used the cloak to cover the body. So the Gemara says, the Rava said, Kanye misna. The dead has acquired the cloak. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kanye misna. Essentially, that cloak becomes like tachrichim, becomes like burial shrouds. And burial shrouds are asr ba'ana. One is not permitted to get benefit from it. So once you spread out that cloak over the corpse, ultimately, again, the dead acquire it. So Amar le Nanoi Bereid Rav Yosef Bereid Rav Rav Kahana. So Nanoi said to Rav Kahana, V'Amar Rav Amar Rav Nachman Alach Rabbi Yehuda. But 1 second, we just said the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. So what does it mean the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? that who is the owner of the nichsei tzon barzel? She is. So she should be able to take her cloak back. Amar le mila mod Rabbi Yehuda de mechusar gavayna. Rabbi say this is fascinating. See, here's the difference. Sometimes somebody could have a right to something, right? I could be the titular owner to something. I have title to something. But then there could be, but because the item is not in my possession, an intervening event could usurp my ownership. Intervening event could usurp my ownership. So this is fascinating. So while it is true that halacha l'maisa, a woman is the owner of the nichsei tzon barzel, she is the owner, because she does not have physical possession of it, at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, at the end of the day, an intervening event could usurp her ownership. So let me just play this out over here. So we'll say, let's take this example. The woman brought in the cloak to the marriage, right? She brought in the cloak to the marriage, right? And what happened? And halacha l'maisa, now you have, right? So we just established halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, that hadini ima. Ultimately, she owns the nichsei tzon barzel. Okay, so don't worry, just open your Gemara. It is what it is. Right? Just get the building built. Just get the building built, right? So seriously, so let's stop with this already. We do this every single week, right? So at the end of the day, the Gemara says as follows: Hadinima. Ultimately, she is the owner of the nichsei tzon barzel. Okay, now say, now watch this. So therefore, husband dies. What should happen with her cloak? She gets it back. Then I will say, there's an intervening event. What's the intervening event? Husband dies. That's not the intervening event. What's the real intervening event? They put the cloak over him. So suddenly now her cloak is used as tachrichim, is used as burial shrouds. Used burial shrouds. So I will say, so she's tining, that's my cloak. We just established it. That's fine, except you're ignoring the intervening event of the fact that it was used for tachrichim. Asar ba'ana. It's your cloak, but it wasn't in your possession. And because you didn't have possession, therefore what? Therefore halacha l'maisa, the usurping event undermined your ownership. And therefore, again, I will say, interestingly enough, even if you hold that halacha, all right, so let's go back there. So the Gemara says, therefore, Rav Nachman paskind, that, or I should say, Rava paskind, that halacha l'maisa, the dead, so to speak, acquired the cloak. So the Gemara gives like this. The Gemara says, Rava l'tamei. We'll say last line, Samech Vav Beis. Rava goes according to his reasoning. Rava, listen to this. We'll say there are other examples of intervening events which usurp ownership, which is, so the Amar Rava, Hegdish, Chametz, Shechrur, top of Samech Zayin, Mafkir Midei Shibud. Rabbi will say, this is fascinating. Let's say you have what's called an apotiki, Rashi points out. An apotiki is like collateral, but it's a very specific form of collateral. So apotiki means, it's a contraction, apo tehe koi. This is from where you will collect. So I'll give you a simple example. I borrow $10,000 from Ruvain. I go ahead and identify. Let's say like this. Let's say I have a bottle of scotch, a very rare bottle that's worth $10,000. You see why I'm using that in just a moment, right? And that's the apotiki to pay back the debt. Let's say, so again, great. So we'll say, now let's say I decide, you know what? I'm makdish the scotch. I give it to Beis Hamikdash. Or I will say, watch this. Or chametz. Pesach comes and I forgot to sell the scotch. Or shichrur. Shichrur, I will say, would apply in a case, ultimately, again, where somebody collateralized their eved, right? And I emancipated the eved. I will say, all of these cases, what happens? The shibud, the lien, is lifted, right? Why is the lien lifted? Because, I will say, an intervening event occurred. Now, here's what's fascinating, right? See, even though the apotiki, to a certain degree, is considered to be in the domain of the creditor, what's missing? What doesn't the creditor have? Possession. And I will say, this is actually a fascinating idea, like legally, which is, you could have a claim to something, but when you don't have possession, another intervening event could come and undermine your claim to that object. It's really a fascinating idea. So in essence, the creditor has a claim to the apoteki. That is the source of his collection. Right, I will say, I want to point out, apoteki is different than regular collateral, because often regular collateral is triggered only when the debtor goes into default. An apoteki often could be considered to be a lechatchila source of repayment. But at the end of the day, it's mechusar gavaina. It is not in the possession of the creditor. So what Rav is introducing to us is, when you have an item that someone has ownership claim to, but it's not in their physical possession, an intervening event could come and undermine their claim to that object. Fascinating. So for our purposes, even if we pass like Rabbi Yehuda, namely that halacha l'maisa, upon death or dissolution of a marriage, a woman has claim to her nishmas barzel in their actual form, not just the value, but the object is hers as well, is if it's extant. Halacha l'maisa, if there's an intervening event between, let's say, the death of the husband and her collection, her claim could be undermined. Her claim, now again, I will say, like in this case, the Yisumim would still be obligated to what? What would they be obligated to do? Pay her back, right? So she'd have to get the value, right? The estate would be obligated to pay her back the value of the cloak. But Lamaisa, same way, by the way, that in the case of the apoteki, the creditor still gets his money, right? Still gets his money, just not from that object. Incredible. So Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say one last piece. Rabbi Yehuda, listen to this case. Let's say a woman went ahead and brought in two objects into the marriage as nishmas barzel. Right, so let's say, for example, she brings in two pieces of estate silver into the marriage, okay? And the combined total of that silver is 1,000 zuz. Okay? Now we'll say, now what happens? And remember again, it's written in the ksuva, two pieces of silver worth 1,000 zuz. Okay? Now watch this. Vishavchu va'amdu shnei alafim. So we'll say, listen to this. And Baruch Hashem, silver appreciates. So now the two pieces of silver are worth 2,000 zuz. So we'll say, so what happens now? What's the halacha? So let's say upon death or divorce, one of the pieces of silver, she gets, quote unquote, as part of her ksuva payment. Because again, remember, the husband guarantees the value of the nechsei tzon barzel. The value that's guaranteed is 1,000 zuz. So upon death or divorce, she'll get back one piece of silver in satisfaction of the ksuva payment. The echad no senes dalam not lost. On both sides, technically speaking, the husband is not, or the estate is not obligated to give back the other piece of silver, right? Why? Because remember again, I both say, who gets to keep appreciation? The husband. That's part of nechsei tzon barzel, right? Husband guarantees the value, and therefore he bears the risk of depreciation. But as part of that, he gets the benefit of appreciation. So therefore, he only has to return one piece of silver, which represents the value that he guaranteed in the ksuva. What about the second piece? I will say now, what she can do is, she could demand the return of the other piece of silver, as long as what? She pays. But the chap is, but she could demand, I'm paying, but I demand that you return it to me. She doesn't get it because she's not owed it. She's owed 1,000 zuz. That's what she got. But she could force the estate to sell her back the remaining piece of silver. Why? Shavach beis aviha. Because remember again, a woman does have a connection, a familial connection to the property she brings into the marriage. So the Gemara says, okay, my kamash malon, shavach beis aviha didahavi. So we already established this, right? We already established this, that a woman has a connection, ultimately, again, to her nechsei tzon barzel. To which the Gemara says, well, it's like, because I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, when do we say that a woman has a right to the actual property of the nechsei tzon barzel? That's when that property is being dispensed as part of her ksuva payment. But if her ksuva payment is satisfied with part of it, perhaps she has no entitlement even to force the estate to sell back to her the remaining part. Kamashwan, that's not the case. Kamashwan Rabosai, that halacha l'maisa, she has the right to force the estate to sell back to her the remaining parts of her nechsei tzon barzel. And Rabosai, this is indeed how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. This is in Even HaEzer, Simin Peiches Sif Gimel. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows: Im he omeres kli ani noteles, v'hu omer damim ani no saying shomin law. Shomin law. Shabbos say Saloch Lamaisa. We indeed passing like Rabbi Yehuda. Shabbos say so again. First of all, we accept these two different categories of property, right? Nichse Malog, Nichse Tzon Barzel, which we've established. We've also established that upon death or dissolution of the marriage, Nichse Tzon Barzel, the value is guaranteed and given back to the wife. What happens if upon, let's say, divorce? Let's just go back, right? She brought in a Rolex, value $20,000. He says, I'm keeping the watch, here's the check. She says, I want back the watch. Right? We pass like Rabbi Yehuda. She could demand return of the watch. She could demand, why? Shevach beis aviha. Because we appreciate the fact that halacha l'maisa, she has often has a familial connection to this property, and therefore she has the right to receive the actual property back in return. Furthermore, again, Abba said the other case, where let's say again she brought in, let's just use the 2 pieces of silver, worth 1,000 zuz. They appreciate the 2,000 zuz. Upon death or divorce, what is she owed? Right, 1,000 zuz, 1 piece of silver. But what can she demand? She could demand that the estate sell her back at fair value the other piece of silver. Beautiful. We'll say that's the halacha. Good, let's go back there. Says the Mishnah. Mishnah Samech Zayin. Bas Yisrael Sheni says Lakohen. So I'll say we're still focused here a little bit. Remember again about how do we get into this whole discussion? We got into this discussion. Remember again in the case of a woman in a legal marriage to a Kohen, and the woman's coming into the marriage with avodim. So the shaila is, do the avodim eat truma or not? So that we got into a discussion about the difference between avodim that are nichse tzon barzel, nichse malug, and we kind of went out from that. So now we're getting back to the avodim case. This is fascinating. Bas Yisrael sheni seis lekohen. Here we go. We'll say a legal marriage. A regular Jewish woman, Bas Yisrael, marries a Kohen, umes, and now he died. And ultimately she's pregnant. So she's pregnant at the time of the death of her husband. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Lo yochlu avadeha b'truma mipnei chelko shel ubar. Her servants, her slaves, cannot eat truma because they are partially owned, or because of the ownership interest of the fetus. Okay, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says over here, Ve'nicha mu'uberes. So this what, it's so interesting sometimes, like, it's always fascinating to see what the Mishnah presupposes we understand from a case, right? Because imagine learning all of this without Rashi. Now, of course, the way Rashi learned Mishnah is that Rashi saw the Gemara and kind of read back into from the Gemara, what the case of the Mishnah actually was. But Rashi highlights over here just such an incredibly important piece of information. Look at Rashi. Ve'nicha mu'beres. Afapi sheyesh labanim himenu. Oh, by the way, you see, you read this Mishnah, and what does it sound like? He got married, right? She's pregnant. Who is she pregnant with? Their first child. No. They have kids. Shabbos, this is an important piece, because remember again, if a Bas Yisrael marries a Kohen, and ultimately again, he dies and she has no children, what's her right vis-a-vis Truma? She has none. She can't eat Truma. However, if she has children with the Kohen, those children allow her to continue to eat Truma. So the case in question over here is as follows. Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen, they have kids, Kohen dies, right? She's pregnant with another child. So we'll say, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, her ability to eat Truma is locked in, right? Because halacha l'maisa, she has kids. Watch this. Her avodim lo yochlu avdei tzon barzel b'truma, lefi shehein shel yarshim, v'yesh le'ubar bahen chelek, ve'ein le'ubar koach la'achila b'truma. Watch this. See, Rabbi said, let's play this out. Incredible. Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen, right? They have a child. They have 2 children, right? Good. And now she's pregnant, husband dies, right? So she could continue to eat Truma by dint of her children. What about her slaves? So I will say, watch this. Nichse tzon barzel cannot eat Truma. Why can't they eat Truma? I will say, when husband dies, who gets nichse tzon barzel? Who gets them? Heirs. I will say, Who's included in the pool of heirs? The child in utero. And the baby who is in utero blocks the avodim, the nichsei tzon barza. Remember again, I both say, nichsei malug, avodim or nichsei malug, they could eat truma. Why could they eat truma? They're an extension of who? Of her. So they could eat truma. But nichsei tzon barzel, where the achrayus is upon the husband, therefore effectively on a certain level owned by the estate, the uber therefore is so fascinating. The uber therefore has an ownership interest in them, and his ownership interest blocks them from eating. Now, why his ownership interest blocks them from eating, we're going to see in the Gemara in just a moment. So it says, let's go. I'm going to relieve the rest of Rashi because we'll see it in the Gemara. So the Gemara goes, so the Mishnah goes weiter. Sha'uber posel ve'eno machal de Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi holds that in uber, a child in utero prevents the avdei barzel, the avdei tzon barzel, from eating truma. Okay, Amrlo. So the Chacham said to Rabbi Yossi, Me'achar she'aretalanu abbas Yisrael l'kohen, af bas kohen l'kohen. The truth is, using your logic, that the presence of an uber, who is part of the inheritance pool, blocks the avdei tzon barzel from eating truma. Why is this only true in the case of a bas Yisrael who marries a kohen? It should be also true of what? Of a bas kohen who marries a kohen. So the Gemara says, "Af bas kohen lekohen umeis v'nichamu beres lo yochlu avadeh betruma mipnei chalko shel ubar." Okay, so the Gemara the Mishnah just leaves that open-ended. We'll see in the Gemara why Rabbi Huda did not address that particular case. So we'll say, let's go. Let's understand this. So we'll say, so what we're left with over here is a principle. What's the principle? The presence of an uber, the presence of a child in utero, will prevent the avdei tzon barzel from eating truma. That's Rabbi Yossi's position. So the Gemara says, why? Ibailu, tam Rabbi Yossi, mishum de kasavar ubar b'mai zara zarhu. So we'll say, is it because, listen to this, it's fascinating. Maybe it's because like this. Maybe an uber, right? Maybe a child in utero, in the womb of a woman who is not a kohenes, is considered to be a non-kohen. Right? The child in utero, in other words, I will say, what we're saying over here is that when you have a child who is the child of a woman who is not a bas kohen, so she herself is a zara, so to speak, when that child is in her womb, he is a non-kohen. The only time he becomes a kohen is when he's birthed. And therefore, I will say, it's fascinating, and therefore, Allah Chalamaisa, you essentially have avdei tzon barzel that are partially owned by who? By a non-kohen, the fetus, and therefore halacha l'maisa that blocks them from consuming truma. Odilma, yilod ma'achil, sheni yilod eino ma'achil. I will say, maybe there's a simpler reason. Maybe the simpler reason is that halacha l'maisa, it is only someone who is born, who is alive, who could enable others to go ahead and eat truma. But someone who is not birthed cannot go ahead and enable someone else to eat truma. Let's both say that the uber, on one hand, we look at the fetus as if it's in existence. It exists, and therefore we look at it as one of the inheritors. But on the flip side, only a living inheritor could allow avodim or could allow, in this case, the avdei tzon barzel to go ahead and eat truma. To which the Gemara says, "My nafkamina, what's the nafkamina between these two approaches? Lo uber b'ma'i kohenes." Oh, boss, I tell you, the nafkamina, as you just mentioned, is if the mother herself is a bas kohen. So we'll say if the halacha is that a child in utero is not a kohen until he's birthed, that's only true if his mother is a non-kohenes. But if his mother is a kohenes, he should be a kohen even in the womb, in which case he should enable the tzon barzel to eat truma. But if it's a din that only someone who is birthed can enable others to eat truma, but someone who's in utero cannot, then it makes no difference about the kohanic identity or lack thereof of his mother. So I'll say, Amar Rabba says, Rabbi Yossi de Kasavar, Uber b'ma'i zara zarhu. Rabba says that halacha l'maisa, the reason for Rabbi Yossi is a child in utero, when his mother is not a kohen, is a non-kohen. And therefore, again, the presence of this, essentially, the avdei tzon barzel are partially owned, quote unquote, by a non-kohen. And that blocks them from going ahead and eating truma. Rav Yosef Amar, no. Yilod ma'achil, she'eni yilod eino ma'achil. Rav Yosef says, no, that's not the reason. The reason ultimately, again, that the avdei tzon barzel can't eat truma is because it is only someone who has been birthed that has the ability to enable others to go ahead and eat truma. But so we'll say what's fascinating according to this approach is that halacha l'maisa. So on one hand, we're saying someone who's not birthed can't enable others. So we'd be tempted to say, therefore, if you're not birthed, you're not part of the equation. Yet, on the other hand, we know that the uber exists, and the existence of the uber tells us that there is another heir coming. Another heir coming. So therefore, I will say, halacha l'maisa, the fact that he's on the scene, but doesn't have the ability to enable others to go and eat truma, blocks the avdei tzon barzel from going ahead and eating truma. Incredible. So we'll say, so again, this is what we've got, the sheet of Rabbi Yossi, but there's a machlokes as to his svara. So meisvei, Miri Zakasha, Amar lo Rabbi Yossi, me'achasha aratalano abbas Yisrael l'koin, bas koin l'koin mau. So we'll say, so remember again, the Brisa says as follows, a little bit of a different version of the Mishnah. In the Brisa, they said to Rabbi Yossi, you told us about a case of a Bas Yisrael who marries a Kohen. But if the presence of the Uber blocks the Avdei Tzon Barzel from going ahead and eating Truma, why is it only a case of a Bas Yisrael who marries a Kohen? Why can't it also be the case of a Bas Kohen who marries a Kohen? So Amar Lahem, Rabbi Yossi says to them, listen, what do you want from me? Zu Shamati, Zu Lo Shamati. Rabbi Yossi says, I only heard the halacha in this first case of a Bas Yisrael who married a Kohen. I didn't hear the halacha in the second case of a Bas Kohen who marries a Kohen. So the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this response. I amrit bishlama uber b'may zara zarhu hainu dekamar lezu shamati vizu lo shamati. So I will say, if Rabbi Yossi's svara is that a fetus in utero is considered to be a non-Kohen, a zar, then it makes sense for him to say, I only heard one case, I didn't hear the other case. The Gemara says, Ella, Iamrit Yelod Ma'achil, She'en Yelod Ein Ma'achil, Mazu Shamati, Zulo Shamati, Ihi. They'll say, but if it's a din that just a child in utero cannot enable someone else to eat truma, then the identity of the wife is fundamentally irrelevant. To which the Gemara says, Kasha. You're right, Rabbi saying that is a good kasha. That is a good kasha. Ultimately, again, on the interpretation of Rav Yosef. Incredible. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Zudiv Rabbi Yossi. These words are Rabbi Yossi. Avachacham omrim yesh lo banim ochlim mishum banim. So we'll say now the Gemara is going to quote over your Bryce. Listen to this. So Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel. Zudiv Rabbi Yossi. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi. But the Chachamim say yesh lo banim. If the Kohen died and left behind sons, ochlim mishum banim. Ultimately, again. I will say now, remember in this case, Rashi points out is the same case as the Mishnah. Kohen married to a Bas Yisrael. Let's say Kohen dies, he leaves behind sons. She's not pregnant. He leaves behind sons. Yesh lo banim, ochlim mishum banim. Ultimately, again, the avadim could eat, right, as a result of the sons, because the sons become the inheritors, and therefore, again, they could eat truma. Ein lo banim. What happens if there are no sons? Ochlim mishum achim. So presumably, if there are no sons, who inherits the deceased Kohen? His brothers. So either way, so the Avdei Tzon Barzel could eat Truma because now they're owned by the brothers. Ein lo achim. What happens about say if he has no brothers? Ochle mishum mishpacha. Right, mishpacha kula. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, so ultimately, again, if there are no brothers, someone is going to inherit these avadim, right? And therefore, again, the avadim could eat truma by dint of whoever they are being inherited by. To which the Gemara says, "Kula zu velo svirale." So I'll say it must be that ultimately, again, this is the position of Rabbi Yossi, but ultimately, again, he does not hold in accordance with it. The Gemara says, really, Ha'amar Shmuel Rav Chana Bagarata, Puk Aisili Be'asara. Go and bring me 10 people, which means, again, I want to publicize something. I want to say to you in front of them, I will say that if a person goes ahead and ultimately what? So I will say, what you begin to see ultimately, again, is that it is only living heirs who have the ability to enable the avadim to eat truma. But bepashtos, ultimately, again, the would be a problem. To which the Gemara Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagarata, go ahead and bring me 10, bring me a group of 10, right? And I want to publicize the following halacha. Hamazake le'uber, if someone goes out and conveys ownership of something to an uber, to a fetus, ultimately, again, kana, he acquires it. Which of us sounds like what? An uber is part of the inheritance pool. Inheritance pool, to which the Gemara says, okay, so listen to this. So the Gemara says, fine. Ella zu usvirale. Rather, it must be that it means this is the halacha, or he quoted this halacha, and he also holds like it. If that's the case, my kamash malon de pligi rabban ali Rabbi Yossi. So what are we coming to learn? That ultimately, again, the rabban argue Rabbi Yossi. Umi pligi. Do they really argue? Masiv Rabbi Zakai zu edis hed Rabbi Yossi mishum shmai bav talyon v'hodalo. We will say yet we learned. Rabbi Zakai said this edus, right? This halacha. Ultimately, in Rabbi Yossi said over in the name of Shmaya and Avtalion. Wow. And ultimately, the Chachamim agreed with him. Amar Rashi, mi katani v'kiblu. Does it say ultimately they accepted this position? Hodu lo katani. They agreed with him. And Rabbi say, here's what's fascinating. Hodu lo could just mean that what? The mistaber ta'ameh. That ultimately, again, they agreed with his reasoning. Okay, so Tan Rabbanan, Hiniach Banim, so we'll say another brayso, Hiniach Banim, if the Kohen died and he left behind sons, Elu v'elu ochlin, and we'll say all types of slaves now are permitted to eat. Look at Rashi, Elu v'elu ochlin, Avdei Malug v'Avdei Tzon Barza ochlin, the Avdei Malug, ochlin b'shvila, she ocheles b'shvil banel, v'Avdei Tzon Barza ochlin b'shvil banim. So we'll say, case number one, we'll say now another brayso, that's similar to our Mishnah. Kohen, right? Bas Yisrael is married to a Kohen. Baruch Hashem, they have children. He dies. She's not pregnant. He dies. She's not pregnant. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, that's an easy case. Who eats truma in that case? Who eats truma? Truma for everyone, right? She eats truma because she has children, even though she's a Bas Yisrael. Ultimately, again, her Avdei Malug eat truma. Why? Why? Because of her. And the Avdei Tzon Barzel eat truma. Why? Because they're now owned by the son. When I say owned, that's not really accurate. In other words, the sons have achrayis for her, and therefore they're kind of like the owners. Good. That's case number one. Case number two, hinicha me'uberes. What happens if, again, Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen, they have children, she's pregnant, he dies, what's the halacha? Elu v'elu ein ochlin. Wow. Okay, interesting. No one's allowed to eat. No one's allowed to eat truma. Rabbi said, look at Rashi, Elu v'elu ein ochlin, sha'uber eino ma'achil loes imo, wow. Now in this price, so what it sounds like is that halacha l'maisa, she can't eat by dint of the uber. Now, we're going to see this probably means that it's talking about a case where there are no other children, right? Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen, she becomes pregnant, first pregnancy, first child, he dies. The presence of an uber does not allow her to eat truma. Only an actual child allows her to eat truma. And of course, then the avodim, obviously, if she can't eat truma, we will say, who else can't eat truma? Her avdei malug. And avdei tzon barzel can't eat truma. Why? Because the only heir is not yet in the world. So the Gemara says, Hinicha mu'beres, elu ve'elu in ochlin. Hiniach banim ve'nicha mu'beres. I will say, so case number one, Kohen dies with kids. Easy case. Everyone eats truma. She eats truma because of the kids. Her avdei malug eats truma because of her. Avdei tzon barzal eats truma because of the sons. Case number two, Kohen dies. She's pregnant. No other kids. No one eats truma. She can't eat truma because, again, she doesn't have yet a living child. Ultimately, her avdei malug can't eat truma because if she can't eat, they can't eat. Avdei tzon barzal can't eat because the only inheritor is a child in utero. Okay, case number three, which Rabbi say is essentially our case. Hiniach bani v'niach me'uberes. Rabbi say, again, Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen. They have two kids. Now she's pregnant. He dies. Now what's the halacha? Avdei malug ochlim kederach she ocheles. Rabbi say, let's work backwards. So she could eat, right? She could eat. Why could she eat? Because of the existence of her other children, right, her two kids, because she could eat, therefore her avdei malug could eat. Avdei tzon barzel lo yochlu mipnei chelko shel uber. Shel uber posel ve'ino ma'achel div Rabbi Yossi. And I will say this price reflects the view of the Mishnah. However, again, the avdei tzon barzel can't eat. Why can't they eat? because of the portion of the uber, because the uber is going to be one of the inheritors, right? And again, remember, it's a machlokas why the uber is problematic, either because he's a non-Kohen, or ultimately, again, because only someone who is living, right, can enable someone else to live. But either way, the presence of the uber will, and because the uber is part of the inheritance pool, he will preclude the avdei tzon barzel from consuming truma. Div Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Omer Mishum Aviv, Habas Ma'achelas. Interesting. The presence of a daughter enables avodim to go ahead and eat truma. So we're going to see what that means. What that means, Abbas. Haben eno ma'achil. Ultimately, a son does not enable the avodim to eat. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, Zecharim yochelu. No. Sons allow avodim to eat. I'm sorry, Zecharim yochelu kulon. Nikevos lo yochlu. But if it's daughters, ultimately, again, they can't eat. Why? Shema yimatze ubar zachar, ve'in lebanos b'makom haben klum. And ultimately, because maybe the uber is going to be a boy, and if it's a boy, then ultimately, again, the boy inherits everything. So the Gemara says, "Mai shema yimatze ubar zachar." What does it matter if the uber is a zachar? Teipok leidin kevanami pasla. Ultimately, again, let's say that ultimately, Rashi says, look at last Rashi over here, Teipokle, Dinami Havi Nekeva Pasla, the Chevan Shechal, Osan Shlefanenu Nekevos. So we'll say, let me go back actually for just a moment. Look at the previous Rashi. Zecharim Yochelu Kulon, Nekevos Lo Yochelu. Listen to this. Look at this Rashi. It's very important. Im Yesh Zachar Bebanim, Ochlim Ha'avanim Bishvilo. So we'll say, now watch this. We're going to go through each part of this Brisa on Amud Beis in just a moment. But if there is a son, right, ultimately, again, the avodim are able to eat. And I will say, now watch this. This is true even if the woman is pregnant. And I will say, we're not concerned about the chelik of the uber. Now, why is that? This is fascinating. Number one, the shemen akevahi. Because I will say, remember, again, with the uber, first of all, you don't know if it's going to be a boy or a girl. If it's a girl, she doesn't inherit. So first of all, number one, maybe the uber is a girl. Ve'in lo chelik b'makom ben, v'im tintzulmer zacharhu shema tapio. And even if the fetus is a boy, maybe she will miscarry. Now, I will say, now watch this. This is fascinating. Shekola yoldos mechza zacharim u'mechza nekevos. I will say, in general, again, I don't know what the numbers are, but let me say, it's according to Rashi, when a woman gives birth, it's a 50-50 chance. Right? Either she's going to have a boy or she's going to have a girl. The Yeshima Pilos, so we'll say, and yet, we'll say, of that 50-50, there's also some segment that what? Or who what? Miscarry. So we'll say, watch this. Samech miuta de mapilos lemechta de nekevos, havile zecharim haruuyim liyoresh miuta ulemiuta lo chashinan. Rabbi say, this is fascinating. If you look at a pregnancy, right? The woman is pregnant. So we'll say, we look at what is the possibility that she's going to have a boy. So we'll say, often we're tempted to say, what's the probability she's going to have a boy? What is it? 50%. Rashi says it's not true. It's less than 50%. Why? Because we'll say, remember again, you also have to take into account that there's some segment, there's some percentage of miscarriage. So if you take the percentage of miscarriage and attach it to the 50% that if it's a viable baby, it's a girl, that means there's less than a 50% chance that the uber is a boy. So fascinating. So I will say, therefore, there is this school of thought that essentially tells us we don't have to take into account ultimately again the uber. You don't have to take it into account because halacha lemaisa, there's only a miut. There's only a minority. Isn't it fascinating? There's only a minority possibility that it's going to be a boy. It's going to be a boy. And therefore, halacha lemaisa, there is no need to bring that discussion into this. So I'll say, back to the Gemara. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, what does it matter if why do you have to bring into this? Maybe the fetus will be a boy. Right? Ultimately, again, if it's a girl, it would also invalidate. So Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, let's go through the Brisa. If it's boys, ultimately, again, the Avadim could eat. I will say, so now one second. So we'll say one of the cases that we thought was kind of like, that the Brisa said was the following case. So just to reframe it. Bas Yisrael, married to a Kohen. They have 3 sons, right? She's pregnant. Husband dies. The Brisa said that what? Everyone could eat, right? Everyone could eat. Let's go through this. She could eat, why? Why could she eat? Why could she eat? Her sons. Her Avdei Maluk could eat, why? Because of her. Avdei Tzom Barzel could eat, why? Right? Because of the sons. Whoa! What about the fetus? What about the fetus, right? Doesn't the fetus preclude the Avdei Tzom Barzel from eating? I will say Amud Beis, Kasavar in Choshishin Lemiuta. Wow! Wow, I will say, watch this. No, because this school of thought says the presence of the Uber has no effect. Why, I will say? Because the possibility that the Uber is going to be a son who would then share in the inheritance pool is what? It's a miut. It's a minority chance. I will say, why is it a minority chance? Because remember again, let's go through the math, right? Remember again, 50-50 chance that it's a boy or a girl. But even if you want to say it's a boy, it's not a 50% chance. Why? The miut, right? There are those who miscarry. So in reality, it's less than a 50% chance that there is going to be another male inheritor. This opinion says essentially, we're not choshesh for a miut. Incredible. Not choshesh for a miut. The other possibility is the olam kasavar choshen miuta. Maybe we do really hold that you're choshesh for the miut. Da'avdinan leitakanta kirav Nachman Amar Shmuel. But I will say, watch this. This is incredible. So we'll say, so just to point out what we have over here, you've got on one hand Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi essentially says, wherever there is a fetus, when the Kohen dies, if his wife is pregnant, Rabbi will say, what does that do? What does that do? Who does it shut down? Right? So it shuts down really only the Avdei Tzom Barzel. Assuming that there are other kids, the only people it shuts down is the Avdei Tzom Barzel. Because she could eat because of her living children. Because she could eat, her Avdei Maluk could also eat. But the Avdei Tzom Barzel are shut down. They can't eat true until that baby is born, because that baby is or that fetus, I should say, is one of the inheritors of the Avdei Tzom Barzel. Okay, so why does the Uber prevent them from eating? That's a machlokes. Either the Uber is like a non-Kohen, or only someone who is alive can enable others to eat. Now, I both say there's another school of thought. The other school of thought is we don't worry about the Uber. The Uber does not come into play over here. Why does the Uber not come into play? Why not? It's a miut. I will say, why is it a miut? 50% chance it's a boy, only 50% chance. Why is it realistic 50%? Because there's some segment, I don't know what the percentages are, but there's some percentage of miscarriage. So therefore, again, it's less than a 50%. It's a miut that it's going to be a male inheritor. I'm not worried about a miut. Now, a third school of thought, incredible. A third school of thought. I will say, watch this in general. When you have Yisomim, orphans who are minors, and now they want to divide up the estate. So Beis Din ma'amidon lam apotropos ubar len chelik yafa. So we'll say, what often happens with orphans who are minors? Beis Din gives them each an apotropos. I don't know what the good English word for this would be, like a guardian, right? A guardian, but it's more than a guardian. It's almost like a guardian is also an executor, right? So a guardian who is able to help them divide up the estate. And each guardian is vested with the responsibility of choosing a nice portion for the orphan they represent. Higdilu, listen to this. We'll say, what happens when the orphans grow up? Yecholum limchos, they could go ahead and reject the portion that was chosen for them and force a redistribution of the estate. Rav Nachman says, no. Higdilu en yecholum limchos. Of course not. Of course not. You can't do that, right? They can't object once the estate has been divided up, because if that's the case, what? If that's the case, makoach Beis Din yofe. What good is Beis Din? Shabbos say, watch this. According to Rav Nachman, what could we do? What could we do ultimately again for the fetus? What could we do for him? We set aside a portion of the estate for him. It's incredible. So let's assume for a moment, okay, we want to be choshesh that it's going to be a boy, he's going to be an inheritor. So we'll say, we're all caught up in, what are we all caught up in? Since the fetus effectively owns a part of the Avdei Malug, and he's unborn, he precludes them from going and eating. It's an easy answer. Separate something else for the fetus to represent his portion in the inheritance. Right? You get this field. This field is all yours. And again, let's separate something that represents his financial portion in the estate. And I will say, what happens when you do that? That removes his involvement in anything else. Incredible. Such a great eitzah. So we'll say maybe not everyone agrees with Rav Nachman. So is not low. Ultimately, everyone agrees with Rav Nachman. So what's the point of contention over here? Rabbi will say, what's that play over here is as follows. Are we choshesh lemiuta? Do we have to be choshesh for the fact that there's a minor possibility that this Uber is going to be a viable boy? That's our machlokes. So Rabbi Yossi says yes. The Rabbanon say no. Incredible. Rabbi Yossi Omer mishum aviv. Rabbi Yossi says habas ma'achil habein eno achil. Rabbi say one of the statements we had in the Brisa was a daughter enables the avodim to eat, a son does not. So I'll say, what does that mean? Why doesn't the son enable the avdei tzon barzel to eat? It's because of the presence of the fetus. But a daughter also should not enable the avodim to eat because of the presence of the ubar. Wow. But say, listen to this. We are talking about a case of an estate that has very little property. The Rabbi say what we are going to see is as follows. If you look at Rashi, b'nechasim mu'atim, the tikun rabbanon habanos yazuna v'habanim yishla psachim. Rabbi say there's an interesting halacha, which is if a man died in a very small estate and he has daughters, as much as sons inherit, when there is a very small estate, Chazal enacted, the estate is used to support the girls. It's used to support the girls. So what should the sons do? So Rashi says, let them get a job. Right, Rashi says literally again, let them go door to door. In other words, they'll figure it out. Boys will figure it out. Right? But if it's a small estate, it goes to girls. So watch this. Both say the case is there's a small estate and there's one son and one daughter. So manavshach, right? So we'll say if the child is born as a son, so ultimately again the presence of a son is not going to be any different than the presence of the existing son. But at the end of the day, if it's a daughter who's born, then why would she enable the avadim to eat? So the Gemara says, "Betakanta dirabanan kama delo nafik la'avira olam lo takinu rabanan." Because we'll say you see this takanta dirabanan, this takana, which essentially says if it's a small estate, ultimately, again, it becomes the property of not the property of the girls, but the girls are sustained. But that takana is only in effect for children in the world, not for children who have not yet been born. So, Ma'akimta, what are you setting up the case with? It must be a case, ultimately, again, where the estate has very little property. Shema yimatzia uber zachar ve'in lebanos makom ben klum. So what did the Seifa say? Because maybe the uber will be a boy, and it'll turn out that ultimately again the girls have no portion at all. Adarabba nechasim mu'atim debanos ninu. Ultimately again, if it's a small estate is given to the girls. Seifa ason nechasim merubah nechasim mu'atim debanos ninu. So we'll say ultimately the Seifa is talking about a case where there's a lot of property in the estate, but in the case of smaller estate, it becomes the girls. And I will say, but we learned that it's true. In the case of a small estate, the sons don't inherit, but it becomes the property of the girls that they're sustained by it. But yet we also learned that even in the case of a small estate, if the sons sell the property, even though that's the wrong thing to do, if they did it, it works, which sounds like they inherit title, to which the Gemara says, Elamai Bas is incredible. What does it mean? I will say, what's the case of Bas where there's a daughter? Bas doesn't mean daughter. What is it talking about? Aim. It's talking about Abosai where there is a case of a mother. Look at Rashi. Elamai bas habas lekani aim v'achei kamar ha'aim ma'acheles abdei malug shala k'derech shaisa ocheles shkeder shaisa ocheles v'aben eino ma'acheles abdei tzon barzel mipnei chelko shal uber. Abosai, what we're saying over here is if like this, if there's a mother, ultimately again, bas means mother in this case. The same way that the mother, the widow, can eat truma, so to her avdei malug could eat truma as well. But halacha lamaisa, again, if there are just sons, the presence of the uber will preclude the avdei tzom barzel from eating truma. Ihachi hainu Rabbi Yossi. If that's the case, then it's the same. Then it's just the shita Rabbi Yossi. To which the Gemara says, "You're right. Kula Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi Katanila." You're right. In fact, the entire Brisa, Rabbi saying the entire Mishnah, entire Brisa, is quoting the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi say, so bottom line, halacha lamaisa, had apologies. We went quickly that last piece, but how do we paskin? So Rabbi say, listen to this. In the Rabbam and Hilchos Trumos, Perek Ches halacha dal says as follows: Bas Yisrael shenises lekohen umeis. Rabbi say, here we go. A Bas Yisrael is married to a Kohen, and he died. Ve'enicha me'uberes, and when he died, she was pregnant. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Lo yochlu avadeh b'truma b'shila ubar shayilod hu shemachil she'en yilod eno machil. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa, the way we paskin is like Rabbi Yossi. That's how we paskin, Rabbi Yossi. So now listen to this. Let's play this out. A Bas Yisrael, and also really it doesn't matter if it's a Bas Yisrael, it doesn't, or a Bas Kohen for that matter, right? So we'll say halacha l'maisa, a woman is married to a Kohen. So again, if they have kids, and now again the Kohen dies, what's the halacha? She could eat, her Avdei Maluk could eat because of her. Who can't eat? The Avdei Tzon Barzal. Why can't the Avdei Tzon Barzal? Ultimately, again, Rabbi say because of the Uber. Sha Yilod Hu Shemachil, She'ena Yilod Eno Machil. Rabbi say because there is only someone who is alive who could enable others to eat. So therefore, since the Uber, this is the incredible part. The Uber is part of the inheritance pool along with his other living brothers. But because the Uber is not yet alive, he's part of the inheritance pool, but he cannot enable the Tzon Barzal. So I'll say paskin like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if there are existing children, she could eat because of the living children, because she could eat, her Avdei Muluk could eat because of her, but the Avdei Tzon Barzal cannot eat, they are precluded from doing so because of the presence of the Uber in the inheritance pool. Osai shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. So wonderful to see everyone.